It was the kind of job Daniel should have ignored. Babysitting had never been his thing, especially for strangers. But the ad was simple. Need a sitter for twins. Well-paid, quiet house. He saw the opportunity to make some extra cash before the semester started. What could go wrong? He'd barely gotten through the door when the chill settled in, creeping up his spine like a quiet warning, too subtle to notice until it was already there. Before I go on, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Daniel wasn't the kind of person who looked for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. His life was a series of monotonous routines. Wake up, go to class, study, sleep, rinse and repeat. Every day felt like an echo of the one before it, the dull buzz of ordinary life humming in the background. He liked it that way. It was easier not to think about anything outside his circle of lectures, textbooks, and the occasional Friday night at the bar. He had friends, few but good enough, but they never quite seemed to understand him. He wasn't interested in the noise of socializing, the endless back and forth of words that didn't matter. Daniel was fine in his own space, with his own thoughts, until he needed something more. That's when babysitting ads like the one he found in the local paper appeared. Simple ways to earn money while staying out of the way of others. This job had come at the perfect time. An easy, no-nonsense gig. The parents were gone for the weekend, and he would be left alone with the kids. How hard could it be? They were twins, 2 kids. He had handled worse. The house was on the outskirts of town, tucked behind a series of winding, narrow roads. By the time Daniel pulled up, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the front lawn. The house itself looked unremarkable. It was large, but not imposing, just another suburban home that could blend in anywhere. The kind of place you could walk by every day and never notice. But as he parked in the driveway, he felt something shift inside him. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if the house had been waiting for him. The silence was unnerving, like the entire neighborhood had stepped back and left him to his own devices. It wasn't exactly the warm welcome he had imagined, but Daniel pushed it aside. He was here to work, not to analyze every creak and groan the house made. The door opened before he even had the chance to knock, and a woman appeared in the doorway. She was tall, her hair dark, tied back in a neat ponytail. She wore an apron, as if she had just finished some task, but her eyes, those were what caught his attention. They were wide, almost unnaturally so, like a deer's caught in headlights. For a brief moment, Daniel felt an odd hesitation, a flicker of doubt, but he brushed it off. She smiled, though it was thin and brief. "Hello, Daniel. You must be here for the twins," she said, stepping aside to let him in. There was a faint tremor in her voice, one he couldn't quite place. "Yeah, that's me," Daniel replied, his tone flat. He was used to these situations, the initial awkwardness before everything settled into routine. The house was dimly lit, even though it was still early in the evening. The walls were decorated with framed pictures of family vacations, birthday parties, and what appeared to be endless photos of the children. A staircase creaked softly overhead. Everything seemed fine at first glance, except for the fact that there was an almost suffocating quiet in the air. It was the kind of silence that wasn't natural, like the house itself was holding its breath. "I'll show you to the kids' room," the woman said, turning down the hallway. Daniel followed, his footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. As they passed through the living room, he noticed the lights flickering for a split second. His gaze shifted to the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. The house felt like it was just old, but the sensation of unease only grew stronger. She led him upstairs and stopped at the first door on the right. The room was tidy, with 2 small beds on either side of the space, each covered with a quilt that looked like it had been freshly made. A rocking chair sat by the window, and a soft, old-fashioned lamp glowed dimly by the bed. It was a peaceful room, with nothing that suggested danger or fear. The woman gestured toward one of the beds. "This is Mason's bed. He's the older of the 2. The other one is Miles," she explained. Daniel nodded, taking in the details of the room, but something about the woman's tone caught his attention. She had said Miles's name without quite meeting his eyes. It was subtle, but it was enough to make him pause. "Where's Miles?" Daniel asked, his voice casual, though he already had a feeling he knew the answer. The woman blinked, her smile faltering for the briefest of moments. "He's just playing in the other room," she said quickly. "He's a bit shy. I wouldn't expect him to come down anytime soon. Just make sure Mason is settled, and he'll probably sleep through the night." Daniel didn't press the matter. He babysat before, and sometimes kids just preferred to hide away. "Okay, no problem." The woman handed him a set of instructions, a simple list of do's and don'ts. Don't open the nursery door after dark. Don't let them watch too much TV. Simple things. She mentioned something about the children having their own rhythm, but Daniel didn't think much of it. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Just one more thing," she said, her voice lowered to a near whisper. "If Miles comes to you, don't acknowledge him. He likes to play tricks. Just tell him to go back to bed. He knows the rules." "Sure," Daniel replied, unsure whether she was joking or serious. With that, she left, leaving Daniel alone in the room. He glanced over at the bed where Mason lay curled up under the covers, his breathing slow and steady. But there was something strange about the way he was positioned, as though he was waiting for something. Maybe it was just his imagination, but the quiet was beginning to press in on him. He sat down in the rocking chair by the window, pulling out his phone. The last thing he wanted was to sit in silence all night, so he began scrolling through his feed, hoping the distraction would make the hours pass quicker. But the stillness didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. The first few hours of the evening passed without incident. The house, though quiet, was uneventful. Daniel spent most of his time scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing at the clock as it ticked away the minutes. He had expected the twins to be more active. Children were always full of energy, especially when their parents were gone. But Mason had seemed content, settled in his bed, his eyes closed in a peaceful sleep. But something didn't sit right. It wasn't the house itself, not exactly. There was nothing outwardly threatening, nothing that screamed danger or evil. It was the way the house felt, the silence that seemed to hang in the air. It was like being in a room with 1,000 whispers, just out of earshot, but always there, scratching at the edges of his awareness. The walls felt too close. The shadows seemed to stretch too far. Daniel tried to ignore it, but the longer he stayed, the more the sensation gnawed at him. He stood up from the rocking chair, stretching his stiff legs, and glanced toward the door. The house was still. The soft tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound in the house, its monotonous rhythm a constant reminder of the stillness. He glanced at the clock on his phone. 8:15 p.m. The parents wouldn't be back for hours, and Mason was still asleep. He had a little time to kill. Daniel walked down the hallway and paused by the door to the nursery, the one the woman had warned him about. The door was slightly ajar, but the air beyond it felt colder, heavier. He could almost feel the chill on his skin, like something was watching him from within. He reached for the doorknob, but then paused, remembering the woman's words. "Don't open the nursery door after dark. Don't let them in." But curiosity got the better of him. The door was just a crack open. What harm could there be in a quick peek? He pushed it open slowly, the old wood creaking as it moved. The nursery was empty, save for the crib and a small rocking chair tucked in the corner. There were no toys scattered about, no clothes or personal items. The room was meticulously clean, unnervingly so. It didn't feel like a room meant for children. It felt like a room meant to be ignored. Then he noticed it. The mirror. It was large, framed in dark wood, and it hung above the crib, facing directly into the room. The glass was spotless, too clean, almost as if it had been polished just for him. He stepped closer, drawn in by the gleaming reflection. But as he peered into it, something felt off. The mirror reflected the empty crib, the rocking chair. But there was something strange in the way the shadows gathered around the edges of the glass, like they were reaching out, extending just beyond the frame. He blinked and shook his head. It was just the dim lighting playing tricks on him. He had been staring at the mirror for too long. Then he heard it. A soft, barely audible sound from behind him. A shuffle, a whisper, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. He turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The air was still. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease wash over him. He was alone in the house, wasn't he? Daniel stepped back from the nursery door, his heart beating faster. He told himself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind outside pushing against the windows. But then the whispering started again, this time more distinct, more real. It was a faint murmur, as if someone was speaking in the other room, just out of reach. His first instinct was to check on Mason, but something stopped him. The thought of the child lying alone in his room, unaware of whatever was happening in the house, made Daniel hesitate. What if the whispering was coming from him? What if Mason had been awake all this time, watching him, waiting? He forced himself to take a breath and push the thought away. "It's fine," he told himself. "You're fine." Daniel returned to the room where Mason lay, and to his relief, the boy was still asleep. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths, and his face was peaceful, free from the strange tension that had been gripping Daniel. But as he stood there looking at the child, something in the back of his mind nagged at him. There was something about Mason's stillness, his quietness, that felt too still, too quiet. Daniel reached down to adjust the blanket over Mason's legs, but just as his fingers brushed the fabric, Mason stirred. His eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly in the dim light. For a moment he just stared at Daniel, his gaze unblinking, intense. Then his lips parted in a soft, raspy whisper. "He's here." Daniel froze, his blood running cold. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Mason didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Daniel, as if he were studying him. Then, with a quiet, almost unnoticeable movement, he turned his head slightly toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to grow thicker. Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. He followed Mason's gaze, but there was nothing there, just the flickering shadows cast by the dim light. The room was empty. Or was it? Mason's whisper came again, this time softer, as if he was speaking directly to the air around them. "Miles? He's always here." Daniel blinked, confused. "Miles? What do you mean?" Mason didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and closed his eyes again, as if the conversation was over. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on him before slowly backing out of the room. What the hell was that about? Daniel's mind raced as he walked back down the hallway, the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room the only sound. He tried to make sense of it, tried to piece together what Mason had said, but it didn't add up. Miles? Who was Miles? And why hadn't the parents mentioned anything about a second child? The whispering came again, louder this time, and Daniel's heart skipped in his chest. He turned toward the nursery door, suddenly aware of the sound that had been echoing from the room all night. It wasn't just the house creaking. It was something else, something soft, like a low, rhythmic hum. And the more he listened, the more he realized it wasn't a hum at all. It was a voice. "Miles," Daniel whispered under his breath, the name tasting strange on his tongue. "Miles, what are you doing here?" The voice stopped, then came again, but this time it was different. It was louder, clearer, and it wasn't coming from the nursery. It was coming from the other side of the hallway, from the room where Mason slept. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He stood frozen in place, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. "This isn't right," he thought. "None of this is right." He turned to look at the door to Mason's room, the handle cold beneath his fingers. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to see what was on the other side. But then, as if drawn by some force beyond his control, he reached out and twisted the knob. The door creaked open slowly. The door creaked open, but Daniel didn't move. He stood there in the dim light, staring into the room beyond the threshold. The air felt thick, too heavy, as though something was pushing against him, trying to keep him from stepping further in. His pulse raced in his ears, drowning out the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. Every part of him screamed to turn away, to leave the room, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But his feet were frozen. The door was open now, and there was no going back. Inside the room, Mason's bed was empty. The blanket lay crumpled, twisted in a heap at the foot of the bed, but there was no sign of the child. For a moment, Daniel wondered if he had imagined it all. The whispered words, the cold weight in the room. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something shift. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, moving just outside the pool of light cast by the bedside lamp. "Miles," Daniel whispered under his breath, though he wasn't sure why he said the name. The words seemed to hang in the air, uninvited but familiar. The figure didn't answer, but Daniel could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The shadows around the room seemed to stretch further, thicker, almost alive, like they were reaching out for him. He stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there, just the dimly lit room, with its stillness pressing in on him like a vice. "Hello?" Daniel called out, his voice hoarse, barely louder than a whisper. He didn't expect an answer, but the silence that followed was deafening. The room was cold, the kind of cold that made his breath catch in his throat, the kind that seemed to seep into his bones. He took another step forward, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of life. And then he saw it, a shadow, small and still, crouching in the far corner by the crib. His stomach dropped as he realized that it wasn't just a shadow, it was a child. Mason? No, not Mason. The child in the corner was smaller, his movements jerky and erratic, like he was playing some kind of game with Daniel. The boy's face was hidden in the shadows, but Daniel could make out the dark, matted hair and the faint outline of a small hand resting on the edge of the crib. Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling now. He felt the words crawl out of his mouth, slow and hesitant, but they hung in the air, unanswered. The figure didn't respond. It just sat there, motionless, as if waiting for something or someone. Daniel took a cautious step forward, but then, in the blink of an eye, the child was gone. Just like that. Disappeared into the shadows, as though he had never been there at all. The room was empty once again, the cold, suffocating quiet wrapping around Daniel like a shroud. But then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then it grew louder, clearer, more insistent. A voice, soft and hushed, calling his name. "Daniel, Daniel." He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, his body frozen in fear. But there was nothing, no one in the room with him, only the oppressive silence that pressed in from every corner. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he backed toward the door. "What is this?" he thought. "What's happening?" Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The figure, now standing at the edge of the crib, its face still hidden in the shadows, but this time, its eyes were glowing, bright, unblinking, and fixed directly on him. "Miles." Daniel whispered again, his voice barely a breath, as if the name itself would somehow break the tension in the room. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him, with those eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, through him. Daniel's skin crawled as he felt the weight of the gaze, like he was being studied, measured, dissected. He wanted to turn away, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. His feet were glued to the floor, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. The whispering came again, but this time it wasn't from the shadows. It was coming from all around him, the soft murmur of 1,000 voices, too faint to understand, but too clear to ignore. "He's here. He's always been here." Daniel closed his eyes, trying to block out the voices, trying to make sense of the madness that was enveloping him. He had to leave. He had to get out of the house before it swallowed him whole. But then, through the whispering came a voice that was louder, clearer. It wasn't soft like the others. It was sharp, direct, almost demanding. "You shouldn't have come here." Daniel's eyes snapped open and his breath hitched in his throat. The figure at the crib was gone, replaced by another shape standing just beyond the doorway. This one was different, taller, looming. And for the first time, Daniel could see the face, pale, hollow, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. The figure stood completely still, its features sharp, angular, like a face carved from stone. "Miles," Daniel whispered again, his voice shaking. "Where's Mason?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, long fingers outstretched, pointing directly at Daniel. The room seemed to tilt, the walls warping, the floor shifting beneath him. His head spun, and the voices in his ears grew louder, overwhelming as though they were coming from inside his mind. "He's here. He's always been here." Daniel backed away, his legs unsteady, his heart racing as the air around him thickened. The temperature dropped even further, and he could see his breath hanging in the air, a mist of cold that seemed to curl around him, tightening like a noose. Why are you doing this?" he choked out, his voice barely more than a whisper, drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its hand still pointing, its eyes fixed on him. "Miles," Daniel said, his voice breaking as he finally managed to tear his gaze away. "I need to leave. I have to get out of here." But then, the figure took a step forward. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Daniel whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. The room had changed. It wasn't the same as it had been moments ago. The shadows had deepened, spread, like ink bleeding across paper. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with a life of their own, and the air was thick, suffocating. The cold had intensified, settling into his bones. And then, through the shifting shadows, he saw something else. Mason. The child was standing by the window, his back to Daniel, his arms hanging limply by his sides. He was facing out into the darkness beyond the glass, his tiny frame a silhouette against the night. "Mason," Daniel called out, his voice desperate, as he rushed toward the child. "Mason, please, answer me." But Mason didn't turn. He didn't respond. Instead, Daniel heard a faint giggle, soft, quiet, as if it was coming from inside his own head. "Miles," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out for Mason's shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the boy's skin, everything stopped. The whispering ceased, the shadows stopped moving. The cold, the suffocating air, it all disappeared in an instant. Daniel froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His hand was still on Mason's shoulder, but the child was no longer there. The room was empty. The crib, the rocking chair, the shadows, gone. There was nothing left but the echo of that last giggle. And then, silence. Daniel stood alone, frozen in the middle of the room, unsure of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. He was no longer alone. Miles was still there. He always had been. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling tales that will keep you up at night, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new video. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think is really going on in this house? And if you're brave enough, share this story with someone who loves a good scare. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, some doors are better left unopened.